The story begins not with a battle, not with gunfire or heroism, but with silence, the kind that settles over a place when history has turned its back and moved on. In a small, overgrown cemetery on the outskirts of a rural French village called Saint-Étienne-du-Rouvray, there stood a grave that no one remembered. No flowers were ever placed there. No family came to mourn. The headstone was simple, weathered by decades of rain and wind, its inscription nearly worn away by time. It read only a name, Soldat Inconnu, unknown soldier, and a date, 1944. For more than 70 years, this grave sat forgotten, a mystery wrapped in the anonymity of war, until a local historian named Claire Beaumont stumbled upon something that would unravel one of the most haunting stories of World War II. Claire had spent the better part of her life documenting the history of her village, piecing together fragments of the past from faded letters, old photographs, and the memories of those few elders who still carried the weight of the war years. She was methodical, patient, driven by a quiet passion to ensure that no story, no matter how small, would be lost to time. But it was the forgotten grave that called to her most insistently, as if the soldier buried there refused to remain nameless. She had walked past it countless times, always pausing, always wondering, who was this person? How did they die? And why, in a village where every soul was accounted for, did no one know their name? It was the autumn of 2016 when Claire began her investigation in earnest. She started with the village records, combing through baptismal certificates, census data, and wartime logs stored in the damp basement of the local archives. She found references to soldiers who had passed through the village during the liberation of France in 1944, American, British, Canadian troops moving north toward Germany. But none of the records mentioned an unknown soldier. The grave appeared in no official military registry, no casualty list, no repatriation document. It was as if the person beneath that stone had been erased, not just from history, but from existence itself. Undeterred, Claire expanded her search. She contacted military historians, veterans organizations, and archival institutions across Europe and North America. She studied maps of the region during the final months of the war, tracing troop movements, skirmishes, and the chaotic days following D-Day. She interviewed the oldest residents of the village, men and women in their 80s and 90s, asking if they remembered anything unusual about the cemetery, about soldiers, about the war. Most shook their heads. Some offered vague recollections of foreign troops camping in the fields, of distant explosions, of fear and confusion, but no one remembered the grave.
Then, in the spring of 2017, Claire received a letter from a woman in Canada named Margaret Thornhill. Margaret had seen Claire's inquiry posted on a genealogy forum and believed she might have information. Her father, she explained, had been a medic with the Canadian Army during the liberation of France. He had kept a small handwritten journal throughout the war, a practice forbidden by military regulations, but common among soldiers who needed some way to process the horrors they witnessed. Margaret's father had passed away years earlier, but she still had the journal, and in it she had found an entry dated August 12, 1944, that mentioned Saint-Étienne-du-Rouvray. Claire arranged to travel to Canada to meet Margaret and examine the journal. When she finally held the small leather-bound notebook in her hands, she felt the weight of history pressing against her chest. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, the handwriting cramped and hurried. But the entry was there, clear enough to read. Buried a young soldier today near the village church. No identification on him. Germans must have taken it. The boy looked no older than 17. We said a few words and marked the spot. Wish I knew his name. The medic's journal provided the first real clue, but it also deepened the mystery. Why would a soldier have no identification? Why was there no record of his death in military files? And most troubling of all, why had no one ever come looking for him? Claire knew that after the war, massive efforts were made to identify and repatriate fallen soldiers. Entire organizations were dedicated to ensuring that every lost soul was accounted for. Yet this boy, this 17-year-old, had slipped through every net, every registry, every memorial. Claire returned to France with renewed determination. She contacted experts in wartime forensics, historians specializing in the Normandy campaign, and even reached out to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission and the American Battle Monuments Commission. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to piece together a theory. In the chaos of August 1944, as Allied forces pushed rapidly eastward, small skirmishes erupted across the countryside. Pockets of German resistance, isolated and desperate, fought delaying actions against advancing troops. It was entirely possible that a young soldier, perhaps separated from his unit, perhaps injured and disoriented, had stumbled into the village and died there, far from the main lines of battle. But whose soldier was he? Canadian? American? British? French resistance? Claire studied uniform fragments, boot styles, buttons, anything that might offer a clue. She learned that the medic who had buried him was attached to a Canadian reconnaissance unit operating in the area during that exact period. That suggested the soldier might have been Canadian, but without physical evidence, it was impossible to be certain.
In 2018, Claire made a bold decision. She petitioned the French government and the Canadian Department of National Defense for permission to exhume the grave. It was a long, bureaucratic process, requiring approvals from multiple agencies, consultations with forensic anthropologists, and the cooperation of the village council. But in the summer of 2019, the exhumation was finally approved. A team of specialists arrived in Saint-Étienne-du-Rouvray, and on a quiet morning in June, they carefully opened the grave that had lain undisturbed for 75 years. What they found confirmed Claire's suspicions and broke her heart. The remains were those of a young male, approximately 16 to 18 years old at the time of death. He had suffered a gunshot wound to the chest, likely fatal within minutes. His uniform, though badly deteriorated, bore markings consistent with the Canadian Army. And there, still clinging to the fabric near his collar, was a small metal tag. Corroded, nearly illegible, but unmistakable. It was a soldier's identity disc, the precursor to modern dog tags. Using advanced imaging technology, forensic specialists were able to enhance the inscription and reveal a name: Private Thomas Edward Calloway, service number C47392. Claire felt her breath catch. After years of searching, the unknown soldier finally had a name. But the story didn't end there. With the name came questions. Who was Thomas Calloway? Where was he from? Did he have family? And why had his death gone unreported? Further research revealed that Thomas Edward Calloway had enlisted in the Canadian Army in 1943 at the age of 16, lying about his age to join the war effort. He was from a small farming community in Saskatchewan, the youngest of 4 brothers, all of whom had enlisted. His mother had written letters to the military pleading for information about her son after he stopped writing home in the summer of 1944. But the official response had always been the same: no record of death, no record of capture, status unknown. Over the years, the family had clung to hope that Thomas had survived, perhaps as a prisoner of war, perhaps suffering from amnesia. But hope had slowly given way to resignation and eventually to silence. Claire tracked down Thomas's surviving relatives, a niece in her 70s named Eleanor, who had never met her uncle, but had grown up hearing stories about the boy who went to war and never came home. When Claire told Eleanor that Thomas had been found, that his grave had been located, that he would finally be brought home, Eleanor wept. She wept for the uncle she never knew,
for the grandmother who had died not knowing what happened to her son, for the brothers who had carried the weight of that uncertainty for the rest of their lives. In the autumn of 2020, Private Thomas Edward Calloway was repatriated to Canada with full military honors. His remains were flown across the Atlantic, escorted by an honor guard, and laid to rest in a national military cemetery in Ottawa. Eleanor attended the ceremony, as did representatives from the Canadian Armed Forces, veterans organizations, and the village of Saint-Étienne-du-Rouvray. Claire Beaumont stood at the graveside, tears streaming down her face, knowing that the boy who had been forgotten for 75 years was finally home. But the story carried with it a deeper, quieter truth, a reminder that war does not always announce its tragedies in grand, visible ways. Sometimes a soldier falls in a place no one remembers, in a moment no one records, and the world simply moves on. Thomas Calloway had been one of millions who fought in World War II, but unlike most, his sacrifice had been lost to bureaucracy, to chaos, to the simple, brutal randomness of war. He had died alone, far from home, and had been buried by strangers who did not know his name. For 3/4 of a century, he had lain beneath a stone that bore no identity, no history, no recognition. Yet Claire's determination and the faint ink marks in a medic's journal had pulled him back from oblivion. The forgotten soldier was forgotten no more. His name was spoken again. His story was told. And in a quiet cemetery in France, a new stone was placed where the old one had stood, bearing not the words Soldat Inconnu, but a name, Private Thomas Edward Calloway, Canadian Army, 1927-1944. Beloved son, remembered. The secret of the forgotten soldier's grave had been revealed, not through grand revelation or dramatic discovery, but through patience, compassion, and the refusal to let a life slip into the darkness. And in that revelation, there was a lesson, that every name matters, every life carries weight, and that even after 75 years, it is never too late to bring someone home.